Hey everybody, this is Kedhrin here from Ilphonic. This is going to be a demonstration showing how we light things in Nexuiz. Although you may be familiar with CryEngine 3, we do handle things slightly different than you may have used them in CryEngine 3, FreeSDK, Crysis 2, etc. So today I'll be showing you a deferred lighting briefing, placing a light, texture projection, light structures, coronas, light beams, post-light shaft volumes, environment probes, light boxes, and lastly, light performance, which is very important. Alright, so deferred lighting, what is it? Deferred lighting is basically the ability to have a lot of lights in one lighting pass. So you're not like worried about the crazy expensive cost of a lot of dynamic lights. It's really cheap. There's no baking, no compile times like you may have seen if you've used any other editors and any other engines before where they needed you to compile light maps and stuff like that. This is all real time. So if you place a light, you can move it, you instantly see the result, and it's dirt cheap. That doesn't mean it's free. You've got to make sure you're not going overboard. That doesn't mean add 250 of these things in your scene and expect it to run well. You also got to understand that every time you put a light on an object, it's going to increase those objects' draw prim count. So it's very important. Also, the engine's a little interesting when lights are overlapping each other. It starts to get crazy expensive. So you got to try to make sure you're not overlapping too many lights on the same surface as possible. So lighting is pretty much an easiest way, I think, to describe it as think of every light as an additive source. So you're not really, although you can use negative lights, I really haven't found too much use for them because they don't actually act like how you expect them to be acting. But just think of it like this. Okay, so if I cut out all the lights in the environment and I have the sunlight and I have the skylight, anything that's going to be in the shadows, especially if I don't have the post-global illumination turned on, it's going to be one solid color. You might see my environment maps on the materials, lighting some areas and stuff like that. So think of whenever you place a light, you're literally just adding the light to what's that default flat light across the environment. And here's where it gets really cool, is because you want HDR to kick in and the eye adaptation that happens with HDR to really kind of take control of it. You can kind of think of that HDR as being like dynamic contrast on some TV monitors, where it will darken the scene and it'll darken everything that's not these light highlights. So that's one way to think about it, and generally it does of course get a lot more complex than that, but I like to keep things kind of just simple, so you just always have that kind of a thought in the back of your head when you're making stuff. So there is a little bit different options if you've used the free CryEngine 3 SDK and especially Crysis 2. We do set CVARs a little bit differently with our HDR and things like that. Right off the bat, I can tell you we have a 0.5 HDR blue shift, which I don't remember what the default is off the top of my head, but I think it actually might be a little bit higher or lower than that. We also have the HDR, how fast the HDR will transition between scenes. A more realistic setting, which is in the default, especially in the SDK, is when you're in, like, for example, let's say you're inside a cave and you're coming outside and there's like a big open terrain, a lot of light, stuff like that. The HDR curve will gradually fade in, your eye will adjust to the scene, the darks will get brighter, stuff like that. But for Nexuiz, we had to make sure that that happens extremely fast, and it's pretty unrealistic how fast, but it's just how fast it is, but it was necessary for us just because how quickly you as a player, you're going through the map and you're going inside and outside pretty rapidly. So definitely something to keep in mind if you're coming in from the free CryEngine SDK scene and stuff like that. Another whole thing I want to definitely mention is color grading is very important. If you don't know what color grading is, definitely take a look in our Wikipedia. We have some information, and also look in the CryEngine 3 free SDK info. But color grading is a great post effect you can do after you're done lighting your map and everything like that. You apply it on the scene, and that's where you can also get some extended range on going into your darks, your midtones, and your highlights. So for example, if I turn on AI physics, which in tension here I have color grade, and you can see it definitely changed the way the level works and looks. And this is very important, and I always tell people this: make sure you're doing color grading as a final step. Don't do it in the beginning. It can be okay to do it somewhere in the middle, but try to get everything where you want it to be first, and then do the color grade, because you'll find that once you have everything generally where you want, you can put the color grade on at the very end, and then that will just make things, you're controlling one thing at that point to adjust everything in the entire scene, an overall effect and vibe for your environment. Make sure you definitely stick around in this video whenever I touch on the performance section, because that's definitely really important, and it's something a lot of people skip because, yeah, it's boring, yeah, it sucks, everyone hates caring and dealing with performance, but it's critical. Make sure you pay attention to that stuff. And another thing also you'll notice in my editor and my videos that I'm showing around is I definitely have smaller helpers on my object. So you can see this little yellow guy right here. It's a little bit small. If you want to change that like I have it, you just go into Tools and Preferences. You go in here, go to General under the Viewport. Is that no Gizmo under the Viewport? There we go. And you got this helpers, the helper scale. That's what that is. I make mine smaller just because it can be really tedious, and these things can really get in your face if you're trying to pinpoint and be very accurate with placing a light, a particle effect, or whatever have you. So keep that in mind if you want to, if you're curious about that. How we edit things is slightly different than what you might use in other CryEngine 3 games. We set up all of our lights in a kind of like a 3-stage setup sometimes, depending on what we have here. So for example, in this light setup, it's comprised of light mesh, which is not always necessary, but if you're placing a light, I recommend, and you have a visible light source coming from that. That's not to be confused if you're doing like a fill lighting for ambiance throughout your environment. Then you have the actual light, which is what's actually casting light in your map. Then you have what we call our fake light, corona lights, and this is nothing more than a placeholder for the little coronas that you see over lights. That's also not to be confused with, as you can see as I'm getting close to this light structure, you see this blooming horizontal stripe going across the screen. That's all in the post effect in the HDR bloom streak scale. You can adjust that in your environment if you want. You can turn those completely off in the environment tab. You can go all the way down to the bottom and cut that thing right out if that, I think it's personally a really cool effect, and I don't think you should get rid of it, but I can understand that there's definitely some really nitpicky players about this kind of stuff, and if you want to do it, then that's fine. We also have on most meshes, on most lights placed, we have what's light beam, and what this is, we generally keep them pretty subtle, but as you can see as I'm going away, you can kind of see, I don't know how well this is going to show up in this video, but there's a little mesh like poking kind of at the bottom and shooting out like a cone of light. What you would think there's like dust in the environment, and the light's hitting that dust, so you're creating a light beam. This isn't like a dynamic thing, it's actually a mesh, and there's a material that controls the origin width, the end of it, the height of it, the opacity, the color, all that stuff's controlled through material applied to a mesh. It's nothing dynamic or anything like that. Then we have some lights, placed around. There's just fill lights if you have a really dark area, or you have something you want to spotlight in the environment. Those are just, we'll touch base on those kind of fill light things. And then of course, really important ones, and it's the biggest bang, is environment probes. And environment probes is literally these little entities you place around the environment, and you're baking a cube map to that environment probe, and the environment probe is then projecting that throughout the environment, and it's literally you're lighting the environment with what's actually there. And this isn't just for something for reflective materials like gold or whatever that's all over these Cavasari maps. It lights the diffuse as well. So these, you're going to actually get natural, realistic fill lighting from environment probes. I recommend using these. For example, usually sometimes some people go, oh, I need a fill light because there's like a lot of red lights in some environments. So you're going to get a red light and put it in the center and fill that environment with red, right? Well, if you have these environment probes, you can place that right in the middle, capture the whole scene, and you'll properly and accurately project that lighting through that environment area. And the amount that you actually get lighting versus a crisp reflection all depends on the gloss value that you have in your material for that. Okay, so let's get started and act like you're creating a light on a brand new layer. You haven't placed any lights in your map yet, and all you have is the sunlight and the skylight. So normally what we usually do is we create a base layer for our lights that we place around. Just, it's more organization things. We always recommend this so you're not bashing your head in later when you're trying to filter through your map and select specific entities only. So we usually create a layer just called lighting or something similar to that. Once you have the new layers created, you want to make sure you double click on the layer in the layers area so you're selected and you're going to be placing new items in that layer only. So to create a light, you got to go over to the roll up bar in the objects area, go into entities, go into lights, and then select a light and simply drag it into the environment and you'll have it placed. To move it around, you can either use the standard movement or Control Shift click, move it around. So once you have a light placed, by default it's just a standard omnidirectional light. There's nothing really too fancy about it. These usually work in a lot of cases, but sometimes you want some fancier stuff. So they do allow you to have a lot of different options you can use to control how it looks and that reacts to things in the environment. So over here in the properties, and the first thing you want to do is in the color, bring that down, and you have the ability to change the color of the light, the diffuse multiplier, HDR dynamic, and the specular multiplier. The fuse, generally, we don't want to go into too saturated colors because it can really cause some super unrealistic lighting. You want to it all kind of depends on what you're trying to do, but we would recommend you stay in lighter areas and not necessarily all the way in the super saturated. Sometimes you might have some crazy saturated light that is it's necessary to do that, but you can sometimes follow a light temperature color chart to get yourself some good values to use in this area. So just choose a light color you want. You can see here in the screen I'm just moving around, clicking and moving around on the colors, and you see it changing in the scene real time. So we can get like a nice HDR blue and have that placed in the environment. And you see, because it's additive, the light's an additive, so literally imagine it's like an additive layer in Photoshop. So the brighter the light, the more it's going to have initially. If you want your desired color, and this kind of color you want to stick with, but it's not bright enough, you can then go into the diffuse multiplier, and it'll multiply the values on top of each other, and you can start getting brighter values. The higher you go, though, you'll start noticing that your textures will start to wash out, so be very careful about that. You don't want to destroy your textures in the process. If you do want hot spotlights, it's understandable. Sometimes you might want, if you want something like to really stand out contrasty in this scene, you can play around with this HDR dynamic value, which will actually go into the HDR rendering. So, as I mentioned earlier, think of it, like how dynamic contrast works on a TV. So you're making this in the HDR rendering, you're making it brighter on purpose, so as adaptation comes into play, it's going to react to it differently. So usually I'll put up diffuse multiplier a little bit, and then HDR dynamic a little bit. Specular multiplier goes straight into your spec maps. So if you want, something to look really, really, really shiny, you can crank that up, and it's going to give you a really harsh spotlight. And this value is really important, especially with if you're trying to do fill lights. You don't want this spotlight at all. So if you're just trying to place an omnidirectional light just to give this area color, you're probably going to actually want there to be no specular multiplier, and that way you're going to completely get rid of any spotlight that's on the ground from it. And that's really handy. Like, if I'm going to go here and click in the radius, I want this whole area to be filled in with that light, and you pretty much get rid of any sort of hot spot that's happening. Some other values you want to, for just a standard omnidirectional light, ambient light, generally you want to turn that on. You do lose a little bit of the spotlight, like hard light factor, but as you can tell, like, pay attention to this corner right here in the center, you can see that the SSDO is reacting a lot different to the light. So we generally keep ambient light turned on just because how much better SSDO reacts to it. It helps you, because you want SSDO to always pop out, because it gives you, if this light, for example, you don't want necessarily casting shadows, but it can kind of give you some sort of simulated effect that it sort of is. Ambient lights is generally used if you are specifically using fill lighting, but we even use it whenever we're placing a light projected texture as well. If you want this to cast shadows, you can go over into the cast shadows, and right here you're choosing what minimum spec is required for shadows to appear in. We generally don't put too many lights that cast shadows because they're extremely expensive, and if we ever do use them, we usually make sure we're using the very high spec, which is ultra. We'll go over this later in the performance section, but let's say, for example, you did want this and you wanted this light to always show shadows, and there you go, your light's casting shadows, and in real time you can see it updating and doing whatever you want it to do. So light styles is also another important field, and what light styles will do is give you some options to animate the light as far as pulsing, not movement, but just kind of some. So if you press 1 in the light style, now it's just doing a steady pulse. What we usually do, like for jump pads, we'll use like a light style of 28, and that'll give you like a steady pulse, but it never really goes into complete black, so you always see like the light from a jump pad light. Or if you're doing like a teleporter, sometimes like a light style of 36, which kind of just gives you some pulsing, just so the light stands out in the environment, so players will be able to see it whenever they're running through. There's also the ability to make something called a fake light, which, as you can see, if I turn this on, the light goes away. And what this is basically doing is it's a light entity that's not casting light, and you might be wondering why you would ever want to do that, and we will definitely be going over that in another section. It's really important though, and definitely useful. So then also there is the negative light. And the negative light, as you can see how everything just went pitch black, is I'm not 100% sure exactly how it's doing what it's doing, but it looks almost like it's like kind of like a color burn in Photoshop layer. So if you choose a value of, like, say white, that means it's going to go all the way black. So it's acting in the invert of light. You can use it, but we never really use it because the extra cost associated with it just isn't worth it to darken something. But if you absolutely have to darken an area to be pitch black, use a negative light, and you can fill it up to your heart's content. Okay, so let's go over a texture projection light. Now, a texture projection light is pretty much the same thing as an omnidirectional light, except for the fact that you're choosing it to project a texture. And the reason why you would want to do this is, let's say you have a spotlight and that's all you want to be shown is the spotlight, and you don't want the light to go in every direction. Omnidirectional lights are cool, but if they're not casting a shadow, they're pretty much very unrealistic in the way that they kind of, if you're using it from a light source, project light. So project a texture, usually is the best answer to this. And you can even think of a projector texture as hey, it's not just a a texture of here's a spotlight, but you're also painting in the gradient fall off from the spotlight itself. So you can put in a lot to a texture, pretty much exactly how an omnidirectional light's working in the first place. All it's really doing is projecting a gradient dot on all sides. So to get this working, when in the light's properties, you want to go down to projector, and then in the texture field you want to click the little folder button to open up your ability to browse. Now you can either create your own, or you can use one of the ones we have made. We currently have one you can use in the Cavisari asset set, and you can go find that just by going into red environment, CryENGINE, and then scrolling all the way over to the right, and you'll see all these things that say spotlights, and these are basically them. You want to choose one. You can click the DDSs and see the different types I have. That's pretty much the only one we really use for directional light is this spotlight_2.dds. And once I press OK, you'll see the light changed, and you can kind of see here on the ground this little crescent shape is the light, the projector texture. And of course I want to make sure I get that pointing downwards as if though I was getting a light on the ceiling and pointing it down. So you just go into rotation and rotate the light. Pay attention to the angles down there on the bottom of the center of the screen, so you see 90 in the Y, and I have the light projected texture straight on the ground. Now you'll notice that the closer I get to a surface, the light gets smaller, and the further I get, it grows properly. But let's say, for example, you like this light and you like how it's hitting this wall, but you want it to fill the area a little bit more. There's this field called the projector FOV, and this is kind of like your own FOV you would have on the camera, but for what this frustrum that's involved with this light. So if you increase that all the way to 160, which is the max this FOV will stretch, you'll have almost 180 degrees of a light. And this is very realistic for if you have a light that's under like a lampshade or something like that. It's very realistic to how it will react and light the environment. And of course, you can crank up the radius and fill up more of the area. So in order to make one of these textures, all you have to do is think of it's additive, right? So you're going to make a texture that's just solid black. Let's look at the texture here. Yeah, you can see that the edges are solid black, 0, 0, 0. You got to make sure it's hitting all the way to zeros. And what you want to be lit to be white. I wouldn't necessarily, and not some cases yes, but make sure you have it desaturated, because if you want to change the color, you can use this diffuse and it'll multiply against that spotlight, and you can actually change the color just like you would normally the omnidirectional light. So if you wanted a red spotlight, there you go. If you wanted a colored light, then yeah, you would as far as the texture, you're going to leave this white, and then you can use pretty much any texture on this. So if I was going to try to just choose another texture like a normal tiling texture, which you probably wouldn't want to do this, you could easily do that. Let's say you wanted this texture, looks like say you're doing a disco ball or something like that. You just simply click project in all directions, project in all DRs, and then you have a light that's just going in every direction. So and that's really cool if you're doing like some certain effects. If you are doing the TIFFs for these, make sure this isn't really going to work properly because it's not saved out right. There's in the RC there is a light projector TIFF format for you to save the light out, and make sure you use that whenever you're saving it out. And that's about it. The textures are pretty small. You can go crazy high resolution with them, but it's really not necessary. And just try to make sure you keep those textures in your proper objects directory so they're uploaded with Steam Workshop. Alright, so a light structure is simply a mesh that grounds a light. Then that's something you want to use if you have a spotlight or something. You we'll probably want a mesh in the environment that signifies, hey, this is where that light's coming from. It's not just coming out of nowhere. That's not to be confused again with fill lights, which is sometimes for gameplay's sake or mood's sake. It's okay. But let's say I want to get a light up on this wall, which you'll see in Siege. I have these little logos all over the place, so I'm going to drag a mesh into the scene, and you can see the materials glowing a little bit, and that's to signify a light source, but it's not actually projecting a light itself. So you get it placed down where you want it to be, then go into entities and drop a light again. Make sure you're on the light layer and move it up just so you can kind of see what you're doing, and choose a texture to use. And in this case I will use the Forcillian logo and get it to where you can make sure you're projecting the light before you get down to where you need to be, because it can sometimes be tricky if you try to do it later. So now that I got the light, and I know that once I rotate it here on the Z-axis, it's going to point where I want it to be. So then I'm going to move the light just right outside the upper surface of the light, and you want that to happen because in case you want this light projecting a shadow, you want to make sure that the light structure mesh itself isn't obstructing that. This can even help in the case of if you put it like right under the lip where you see the light, and there's this little mesh kind of insetting the emissive glow, and you have this as casting shadows, and like on a high FOV of 180 you'll actually see that mesh casting the shadow and obstructing the light. So once you have it where you want it to be, you just crank up the radius, and then you have the light projection off a mesh. And in this case, for example, I like the radius, but I think that it's blowing up too much for the effect I want. So in this case, I'll actually decrease the FOV on the light projection to have it fit down to kind of where you want it to fill in the area. Now, after you get that done, maybe you want to rotate it a little bit just to kind of get it exactly where you want it to be. And that's all there is. Okay, so with Coronas, we handle things maybe a little bit different than what you may have read or used to in other CryEngine 3 tutorials or elsewhere. We generally keep Coronas and the light itself on their own two separate entities because of the fact that Coronas will take in your diffuse color and your diffuse multiplier into account with lighting and making how visible the Corona itself is. Usually if you have a light and you're cranking up the diffuse multiplier, it's going to reflect those changes in the Corona, and you usually don't want that because Coronas are usually meant to be really subtle in the environment and just kind of as an after effect. So if I was going to create a Corona off this light, let's go ahead and change it to blue so we can have it more noticeable. And I was to say crank this up to 5 and the HDR dynamic to 2, it's giving me a really bright Forcillian logo there on the wall, which is cool and all. But if I was to add a Corona to this material right here, it would look really, really bright. So what I would do is I'll copy it, make sure I'm on the grid so I can get them stacked right on top of each other, and then I'll just simply mark this as a fake light. And now it's no longer projecting a texture like the other one is, and it's just a placeholder for the light itself. Now whenever you get a fake light, again, always try to make sure you're putting these on their own layers too, and that's just again so you can easily manage them later. And move this over by just going into the entity properties, clicking the layer button so you can choose what layer to place it on. And then to make things even easier, make sure you're only editing the fake lights layer itself. Once you have that all done, you want to go into your materials and move this into scene. And we have some Coronas already made that you can use, or you can try to make your own, which go over that in the Wikipedia section on Coronas, and you can find these in materials, Coronas, and here we have a bunch. I recommend 5 is a really good one because as you can look at the texture here, it has some good gradient fall off and some good streaks, and you'll notice that it has black all around this square texture. There's also Corona 06 is just a circle dot, and a circle dot, though cool, is just, it's not really realistic to how a camera would react to it. There usually wouldn't be just a solid dot just sitting there. So I simply just click Corona 5 and then I apply the material to this. Once I have that done, I'll move that window out of the way. I now have this Corona here on the mesh, or on the entity. I'll go into its properties, go down into the style section, and you'll see these Corona settings. Sometimes we'll do like a Corona scale of like 10 or so, and or 3 rather, and just so you can see it. Now as I go farther away from this object, you see that faint little blue on the Corona, and that's really all there is to it. You add the Corona, and then you can control its values independently of the other light to make it brighter and stand out a little bit better. You don't want to go overboard with this because it can quickly start to look really fake if you have like really crazy bright Corona values just in the environment. But if you need something to stand out, like for example, for gameplay's sake, you want the player to look down this tunnel and definitely know, hey, that's the blue side I'm going into. So maybe you want to do something exaggerated to really show that area off. The thing to note about Coronas is, if you notice, as you get further away from it, the Corona gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It also, as you get closer to it, it'll get smaller, and eventually there's a good range. By the time you get close to it, you'll usually be hitting the HDR for streaks and stuff like that, so where it can simulate the Corona up close a little bit better. So another thing about Coronas is to notice when you go around a corner, you'll notice it pop out, but there's always going to be a slight time when you might see it drawing on top of another surface. Keep that in mind. Another big thing to note about Coronas is be careful when you're doing the size. Like, yeah, the size is cool, but if you, for example, if I'm right here and I'm looking at this Corona and I'm trying to say, oh, I want this the good size, yeah, that's fine. You want to set your size how you want it, but make sure like 10 looks great, but be careful, because when you go further away, that Corona is going to get massive. And that's a cool effect, but that can really start to stack up on overdraw and really start to hurt performance. That's generally why we keep Coronas only on higher specs and not really on lower specs to begin with. I recommend generally, if you're doing a general light placed in the environment, let's say like I have this Corona actually like applied to this light on the wall, and I'll try to match its base color. I will try to do one at a time and just make sure that one is perfect, right? Like, oh my god, that's too big, so I'm gonna scale that down to, you know, maybe since this light's more duplicated all over the environment, I'll probably make it like a size of, let's say, 2 there, and then I'll drop down the diffuse multiplier, keep it really subtle. And you want to do that because what's going to happen is, since these are tiling all over the place, there's going to be instances where you're looking, you know, almost parallel to the light sources, and these are going to start stacking, and when they start stacking, they add on top of each other, so you're going to get some weird coloration going on. You can definitely tell that we use that a lot to add a lot of flavor and style to the maps, especially in the Forcillian and Cavasari levels. If you have one placed that you really like, just duplicate it over and over. Make sure you have it in the place where you want it to be for all the lights. And then what we'll generally do is, like, say, you know, these are all acting the same way, so if we need to edit them, we'll select them all and then edit them all at once, and that way you can see an overall effect instead of rather having to go to each one by one. Another thing to remember with the way we do Coronas is, in the Corona material itself, you'll notice that the diffuse values are relatively low as far as the brightness, and that's just so we have more subtle control over the lights and how they're placed throughout the environment. Okay, so light beams. Now that we got a light structure, a Corona, and a projected texture, sometimes it might be nice to add a little bit extra grounding onto the light by putting a light beam. The light beam will simulate, you know, just imagine you having a flashlight and you're seeing the beam of light cut through fog and smoke. That adds a lot of really nice atmospheric effects. The reason why we don't use them all over the place every time you see a light is because once they're stacking on top of each other, they definitely do hit overdraw, and they're also not regular brush entities, they're geom entities, so it's like a dynamic entity, and that means it's not that cheap. So first things first, you want to make sure you're creating a layer for your light beam specifically, and again, that's just for management purposes. And go and make sure you have the layer selected, and instead of going what you normally do with like a brush or entity, you want to make sure you're going into geom entities. And there's definitely different ways you can do this. I just prefer to use the default one that the SDK came with, and you can filter that just typing in beam here on the filter, and then you'll see right here on the bottom in the library lights there's this beam mesh already made for you. Dropping that in, placing it down, you'll automatically see that there's already a beam material kind of set up and ready for you. Now I'm going to make sure I'm rotating this in the same angle as the light and placing it as close as possible to the center of my light structure. Now you'll notice immediately the default light beam it's just too big compared to that light itself. So in this case, in this light beam, another note, you'll find that it can be kind of tricky to select these things. You can either do it by dragging a little box to select it, or just by holding down space to make sure you're selecting that geom entity. Once you have this set, you might not want that width to that light structure. It's really important to note that these aren't changed really per instance. Anytime you want a light beam to look different, you're going to have to create a new material to reflect those changes. So if I go in the material editor and I just filter also beam, you'll have an easier time finding these light beams. I made some in Siege already, and let's go ahead and select this first one, it's the neutral one, and I'll apply it to that material. I'll just apply it to the mesh. And now once I have it applied to the mesh, I don't have to do anything else with the mesh in the game world itself. Everything you need to control the way this looks, acts, the width, the whole bit is all controlled within the material. And there's some very special fields for you here that you need to make note of. The end radius is how at the base of this light beam, how wide it goes. You generally, I wouldn't recommend like going too big, because you can see like up here at the top, you can start seeing these weird steps that happen, and that's just because the mesh is getting so spread out that you're seeing gradual changes in the transparency through the effect. So I mean, you can keep it wide, but I try to keep it not going crazy overboard. Then you have the color multiplier, which will literally multiply against kind of the background behind it, and maybe you need a beam that's really noticeable, and you can use that for exaggerating that effect. I generally prefer to keep it kind of subtle. The soft intersection factor will basically when a mesh comes through it, and that's helping you so you're not seeing a hard line on that mesh. The start radius controls the radius at the base, so you can adjust the start radius at any time to kind of control how wide that base is. You want to match as closely as possible to your light mesh, so they're lining up properly. This one's off a little bit, but whatever. Other than that is you also have length control, and that's it's another kind of issue you might run into whenever you're, like for example here in Siege, you'll notice on the finished map I don't really have these light beams on this second tier in the center area, and that's just because I didn't want to create another material just for that use. So keep that in mind. And here in the shader generation params, you have the ability to add a noise map, and that adds that little texture that you can see tiling through the material, and that just kind of gives it some life and the disbelief that there's a lot of smoky and kind of dust in the area, which there probably would be if you're seeing a light beam. So keep that in mind. If you have a really bright light beam, you probably should be making a lot of fog in your map, because you wouldn't be seeing this light beam unless there's fog or heavy amounts of dust or smoke. Alright, so this time I'm going to show you light shaft lights, and this is like a post effect. It's not to be confused with exact light shafts that you might see from the sunlight. It's kind of a little bit faked and not as accurate, and the biggest problem with it is that it'll pop through meshes, so you got to be really careful. It's not true obstruction, what you might expect. So to get started, again, create a layer. This is a really expensive effect, so you'll see us labeling these things as like special effects. And we'll go ahead and place a light down, and it's relatively easy to use and to get set up. So place a light and then just scroll down and you'll see this field that says post effect. Change that to 1 and there you have it. You have a light shaft and you can easily see right here the effect. And this is really cool. It's absolutely awesome. I do think it's something that you really want to try to design your maps for from the get-go if you're going to use this effect, or try to use it really subtle, and you can still get some cool stuff out of using it that way. Because yeah, seeing those beams get cut through from if there was a light in a foggy area or something like that, you can really use it there. And see, the big issue is, let's say I'm trying to use it on this floor above, and yeah, from here you can see it's getting cut on the floor, but then if I go to the floor below, you'll see it pop right through. And so always be mindful of that, and always making sure you're keeping the min spec layer for this on very high. Okay, environment probes. These are the most important lights you can place in your environment for really setting a mood, vibe, and naturally lighting your area. Keep in mind that these will add an entire another lighting. So if you're dealing with light stacking and you're worried about performance, just always make sure you keep that in mind, because it'll add a second one on top of the sunlight even, or even a third one if you have some placed lights around your environment. To get started, you need to make sure that whenever you're baking these environment probes that you're using DirectX 11. Well, let's talk about, let's say that you don't have DirectX 11 because you don't have a video card that can support it. If that's your unfortunate situation, you do have the ability to still bake environment probes, but they're not going to look as good. What's going to happen is the environment probes in DirectX 9, they don't capture the sunlight or the skylight, but they will capture global illumination if you have that turned on. So you can really carefully, as you're baking the environment probes, just kind of try to get it as good as you can, but understand that that's really not going to work the way it's meant to. You also can't bake environment probes at 512 by 512 or 1024 by 1024 in DirectX 9. So to make sure you're in DirectX 11 for the editor, in the Steam directory under common, Steam Apps Common, Nexuiz, you'll see this CFG called dxmode.cfg, and you can open this up with whatever notepad editor you use, and you can even use the default one that comes with Windows. And you'll see this r_drivers equals DX9 or DX11. You want to make sure this does say DX11 in the quotes whenever you're editing in the editor. And this is a different CFG than the one I'm using currently that's in the editor. But make sure that's in DX11 mode, or environment probes just aren't going to bake properly. Okay, so let's say, what is an environment probe? So let's imagine I have this really cool hot sun and bright blue sky above me, but then below I have all this gray kind of brown materials on the sides and stuff like that. An environment would naturally light based on reflections. Everything has reflections, even if it's really not a shiny surface, it's still reflecting light whenever light hits it, and that light therefore is coloring the environment around it. It's what simulates global illumination, everything like that. So that's kind of what an environment probe is in a nutshell, but also if you have a really shiny surface, you're going to get a more crisp resolution of the surroundings. And always remember that it's not a live, not a real-time reflection, so you're not going to see the player. It's just baking a fake capture of the scene. So what controls that glossiness, also the crispness of the reflection, is the gloss scaler inside a material. So you crank that gloss scaler up, you're going to get closer to a 1-to-1 reflection. And you might want to be careful with that. Maybe don't go super high into that, only because if you're using a low resolution environment probe, which I recommend doing to save on texture memory, you're going to see some really pixelated, jagged edges in the texture itself, and just seeing a crisp mirror reflection on a super flat surface realist and it's not getting distorted much, it just really doesn't look that good, and sometimes it'll take the player back if they're looking at this super crisp resolution and they're not seeing themselves and they're not seeing everything else dynamic in the environment. Even though Nexuiz does use screen space reflections, they're not to the full level what you would think they would be. They're just kind of more of a almost like a subtle, nice touch, but don't expect like one-to-one real-time reflections just yet. So to get started making Environment Probe, of course, definitely with Environment Probes, you want to set these on their own layer because you will be editing these a lot, and you want to make sure you can hide them and unhide them a lot so you can make them properly. So I'm going to go ahead and create a layer specifically for them. Make sure I'm in that layer, and then to find these, you want to go over here in the objects area, go into miscellaneous, and then choose Environment Probe. Now once you have one down, place it, and when you're placing these around, you want to make sure you're getting in a spot that's not too far from where the player's eyesight might be, because in a lot of cases you might have certain things in the environment that are lower or higher than where the player will ever be. So if they're looking straight ahead and they're seeing a reflection of an object that's clearly up below them, that might throw them off, but sometimes it's unavoidable. It just kind of depends on the situation, but just always try to keep that in mind and try to do it if you can. Once you have an Environment Probe placed, it's pretty simple. The settings you got cube map resolution in the properties. I recommend using 256. That creates a, so the way to think of this is, this doesn't mean the whole cube map itself is 256 by 256. A cube map is comprised of 6 sides: top, bottom, left, right, front, and back. This is saying what resolution each one of those sides are. So 256 by 256 on each side. This can produce some really high resolution textures, especially if you're using 1024 by 1024. A 1024 by 1024 cube map resolution will probably generate something like a 45 megabyte file, and that's really high for a texture. You probably don't want to do that, but I can understand there might be a time when you absolutely have to. So we use that 256, and there's also this neat little button, preview cube map, which right now it's just gonna be solid black because I haven't generated anything. Real quickly, let's just generate one so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so once you click generate cube map, you'll see that the editor kind of snags just a little bit as it bakes. The higher the resolution, the longer that bake's going to take. So once I generated the cube map, I can click preview cube map here, and you'll see it made me a little sphere, and I can actually see what the cube map took, and it took a 1-to-1 reflection of the environment, and it's going to project this image across this whole area once I crank up the radius. By default, the environment probes are turned off whenever you place them, so make sure you click activate, and you'll immediately see below that this surface is now all of a sudden glowing blue. And the reason why is because if you look at the top of the cube map, you see sunlight. So that's what it's showing, is directly from the top looking down, you're getting sunlight. And in this case, it's a little bit brighter than what you might think and see on this sphere, and that's because the gloss values on this metal surface is fairly low. So if I turn up the radius to fill up the area more, I'll fill up this entire map with that kind of lighting. You do have the normal controls of like a regular light. You can change the color, you can crank up the diffuse multiplier, you can turn on some HDR dynamic if you want to, you can crank the spec up. I generally prefer to keep these things on default. Sometimes I might lower the diffuse color just a little bit, just drop down the values if it's just turning a little bit too bright for my taste. One thing you'll also notice here, coming into the cube map, getting real close to it, that if I look here on the bottom especially, you'll see the rocket launcher right below is baked into the cube map. And this is where layer management is really important, and you got to make sure you're doing this, because you don't, if you have a crisp reflection anywhere, you don't want to see that rocket launcher there as the player's running around through the environment. So whenever you're baking, I generally always recommend hiding your gameplay layer where you have all your gameplay items. Jump pads and teleporters are fine, especially if they're casting off a lot of light. Teleporters definitely big on that, so you want that captured in your cube map. But things like armor shards and item pickups. They're not always there, especially the mutator items, so make sure they're not there when you're going to capture a cube map. Once you've placed one down, I also recommend, it's an interesting thing, they're usually turned off by default, so whenever you bake it, you're not doing a double bake of the same cube map. So if you bake and it's active, you're literally just going to bake the environment plus the already projected environment cube map. So what I like to do is keep the entity selected, and then I'll hide the layer, but you'll see that I can still edit it even though the layer's hidden, and then I'll generate the cube map again and then unhide the layer, and now you'll see the rocket launcher's gone and it didn't do a double bake on the cube map. Other things we like to do is sometimes you might want to turn off global illumination whenever you're baking a cube map, because it can produce some undesirable results. You got to remember the global illumination is a screen space effect, and all this environment probe is doing is taking the view frustum from a 90-degree angle on 6 sides and taking pictures. So it's going to, global illumination as a screen effect is going to look a little bit different from each one of those. So sometimes you might get some seams or some weird artifacts you may necessarily not want. Whenever we have a lot of environment probes, you can select them all and change their properties pretty easily. Just, if you had like 1 or 2, select them, and that's usually if we want to change the resolution. Pretty much that's about it. But it's really easy to, if you have just one selected, hide the layer, and you'll see this generate all cube maps, and I'll go ahead and recapture every single cube map in the environment. Now, there's a really important technique that you'll see us use quite frequently across our maps that they unfortunately don't allow, and we'll talk about this a little bit more also in the next section. But for example, if I wanted both of these to have the same cube map but act the same way, I can go into the first one, go down here into the options advanced, and it'll give me the path to the cube map it generated. I can simply go in here and copy that, the actual field to that texture, go into the second environment probe, go down to the same area and paste it, and that way I can have these literally using the same environment probe. And you want to use that when using light boxes, because sometimes you'll have to have them cut off from each other, and then we'll be using the same environment probe, so you don't have to double the texture memory used. Another important thing to remember with environment probes is they do act exactly like light. So whenever you have your radius, it's going to fade out from the center. So whenever we use, for example, light boxes, most of the time we'll just fill in the entire box with the outrageous value to make sure everything within that light box has the same value. So usually if I use like a radius of 100 and I want to make sure that this inner area is completely affected by this environment probe, that's fine. But if you're just focusing on the outer bounds of the light radius, and as you get it lower, you'll see that the little yellow lines representing the radius of the light. As you get closer to the edge, you'll see the light environment probe starts to fade out. And then, that's kind of just a preference thing. You'll definitely see us using that, but not all the time. One more thing to remember is sometimes if you have multiple environment probes really close to each other and you're not using light boxes, it is possible if they're stacked and on top of each other, you will see some flickering between the surfaces as the mesh is trying to figure out what environment probe you're trying to use. So the mesh will literally get confused and it'll start flickering on the surface what environment to actually light the mesh up with. Okay, so I'm going to quickly describe light boxes and why they are so important, especially when dealing with things like environment probes and lighting in general. So something to really note is the fact that there's 2 different ways you can confine a light. There's a light box and a light shape. A light shape will let you pretty much just draw the way a light will be confined to an area. So if you got multiple lights or something like that, you can pretty much just say, hey, light, only stay in this area, and it makes you draw like a custom shape. You could do concave shapes, the whole bit. These don't work with light boxes, so we generally just keep our usage of all these just straight to light boxes. Light boxes is the only thing that can contain an environment probe, and they're really important, and not just for performance but also for aesthetics. So let's get started. I'm going to create another environment probe. Make sure I'm in the environment probe layer. Place one down. And I'm going to generate the environment probe in this little area because there's an overhang area, and I also want to make sure it's filling this entire space. So creating the environment probe, you can see it's captured this little corner area and stuff like that. I'm going to crank up the radius on it so you will simulate the effect of, let's say, you want it to slowly fade away as it's getting into this corner. So looking at the radius, you can see that it's getting darker as it goes into this little back area, which is what would happen. And you also want it to get brighter as it come out into this outer space. But the problem is, immediately straight above, the floor above, since it's omnidirectional, it's now casting into this room above where the environment probe is baked. So you want to confine this environment probe to a light box. To do that, generally keep our light boxes on their own layer as well. So I'm going to create a new one for that. And I can find these in area, in the objects area, and just place a light box down. And you'll see that it's just a simple box. Try to keep this on the grid. If you get it off your grid, just press the snap to grid button. And the way you want to do this is you want to try to line this up with your render mesh, usually lining it to where there would be a scene. It's really important to note that if you're going up on the z-axis, it will create z-fighting if it's perfectly flat against another surface. So once I try to create it in the general area I want it to fill, let's say I'll start here, push it in the wall, because if it's going straight up, it's gonna cause some z-fighting. So I'm going to try to just get it into area, fill in this whole space. Okay, so then I'm going to increase the height on this to fill in up to the ceiling, just going slightly above the ceiling again, because you don't want to create any z-fighting on the ceiling's flat surface. If your light box is disappearing, you just need to make sure that you're looking at the entity itself. So just make sure the axis is in view, and you generally won't have any issues with disappearing on you. So if you look in this case, you see the blues flickering right there. That's causing z-fighting. That means I'm a little bit too far out, and I need to make sure this box is just poking in so I'm not creating any of those z-fighting faces. Now once I have this done, make sure the floor is in just a little bit too. Make sure it's the ceiling. I have this done. I'm going to collect the environment probe, and I'm going to scroll down to the bottom where you see entity links, bring that down, press pick target, and the easiest way to do this is hold space, and you'll see this little light box 1 on the distance. I'll click that, and it will draw a green line to the origin of the light box, signifying that it is now linked to it. Initially, you'll notice that it didn't do anything, and that's because you need to reactivate the environment probe and make sure you have deferred clip bounds checked for this to happen. So there you go, you see the environment probe is now contained within the light box. You do have this issue where now there's a very harsh scene. Here it's not as bad because I built the light box to make sure it's pointed right in where this texture is. Here you can see some Z fighting going on because I didn't move the box over far enough. And holding space is generally the best way to select these things. So there we go, I got rid of the Z fighting there, and there's no Z fighting there. Now, in order to get rid of the seam here, and I want this same gradient fall off happening all the way down. This operation is a little hacky, but it's the only way that we found to kind of resolve this issue. And you want to make sure you're getting the light box to fill in the rest of the area. Again, match it on some seams so you're not getting any weird issues. Let's try to match this just to this area so it saves some confusion. And I want to raise the height so it's going all the way up to the ceiling. You can see there, again, some Z fighting. And this is one of those times where you can decide you can fight the Z fighting or just allow a little bit, enough to where you wouldn't really notice. So if I'm like right here on this little lip, like you won't really notice that tiny little lip of Z fighting, so it's fine. It's not a big issue. Let's move that in because that's... And then, wherever the other light seam is, you want to make sure this is matching up perfectly to it. There we go. So that light box is now aligned perfectly right there. Now here comes the hacky part. You want to take your environment probe you made a little bit ago, copy it, then you want to make sure it's definitely using the same texture value. And I recommend copying and pasting once because that way you're making sure you're not double your texture memory. Make sure it's placed in the exact same spot too, so you're having the same center of origin of the light gradient. You want to delete the link that was already here, and now you want to make sure you're picking the new light box. Now that one is contained to this light box. Then make sure you reactivate the environment probe. Now you have them contained within the light boxes. So light boxes, again, in here now I'm not seeing the environment probe anymore. It's fully contained in that one spot. And it's really important to make sure you're making sure your environment probes are contained within their areas. And it can be tricky because if you have more organic shapes, circular shapes, things like that, you just gotta try your hardest to cover up your seams as you create them. Okay, so let's quickly talk about performance now. So lighting performance is really important. You'll find that lighting is one of the biggest causes of massive performance hits within Nexus, and there's multiple ways to approach making sure your level is optimized for lights. First and foremost, I need to state that what you see in the min specs, and every entity you place, you'll see this minimal spec, and you can change it from very low, low, medium, high, very high. This is the global slider for lighting that you see. It's not to be confused, even though the parent one you see in video options that goes from like low to ultra, it's actually lighting is the only one that's affected by this, and this is very different from how everything else in CryEngine 3, the free SDK, or Crysis 2 is handled, because there wasn't a separate slider or scaler for lighting, so we just used this one C-bar called object quality or something like that, and it basically controls this min spec. And even though you can use it on a ton of different entities, reserve it specifically for lighting through your environments and make sure you're using it like that. Just keep in mind, even though this says very high, that's not very high in the video settings. This is actually ultra, so that's just something to note. And you'll also notice that in ultra, a lot of things such as view disk ratio are set to pretty permanently high, so you won't see objects disappearing and whenever you're in very high in the editor or in game, because the view disk ratio is cranked to not make objects disappear. So if I want to change between the config specs that you see in lightings within the video, options, you can go over here to config spec on the toolbar and just change between them here. So a good one to always do is medium to start off with, because then you can kind of see what a good majority of players already see. Whenever you change video settings within the editor, get ready for this to happen, because it's got to recompile shaders if you haven't already done so. So once you have that back, the first thing I want to talk about is view dist ratios on lights. If you have a lot of lights in a scene, you probably want shorter view dist ratios, so the further away you get from a light, the quicker it'll disappear. The good thing about lights within CryEngine 3 is they don't really necessarily just pop out. A lot of times they'll give you enough time to fade out and fade in properly as you go through it. So if I turn down that view dist ratio to 5, which is with lights generally you have to use very low numbers, because they're generally big entities in the first place. You can see as I go in and out, the light just turns on and off. It's usually players won't notice many lights being turned on and off, especially if you have a lot in one environment. Really important to note also that between the different config specs, the global view dist ratio, which multiplies against this entity's view dist ratio, is going to be different, except for very low, which doesn't use lighting at all, so you won't even see any lights because we hard turn those off, so don't even expect to see it in there. But view dist ratio is different, so keep that in mind and go and cycle through these config specs and look at what your lighting's doing and how it's changing between them. Don't just edit in the very high settings. Make sure the level looks decent and runs fine, and your draw prim counts and your light complexity isn't skyrocketing on low settings. If you have like very hard like gameplay specific lights, make sure you're keeping them on all min specs. You know, again, they won't show up on low, on the very low one. But if you have other lights that aren't really necessary and they're just there to make things a little bit prettier, why don't you just go ahead and put that on like high or very high settings, because it's not really necessary for gameplay. And you'll find players, even if they have really beefy machines, some of the really hardcore players put the settings on low on purpose just so they get an increased performance boost. And so to them that's really important, and it's not necessary for them anymore at that point. Whenever you're going to use shadows, we only use shadows on the light on very high. So make sure you're going to go ahead and set that to very high if you're going to use a shadow, just because you're being nice to players pretty much at that point. You notice shadows will not show up in the low config spec, so if you're going to do shadows, act like you're in the config spec, they're going to be used in. So go into Ultra and fire them off there, then you can see shadows being used again. Whenever we have coronas on lights, we always make sure that the coronas are on at least the medium spec layer. We also need to again remind you that, you know, coronas you got to be careful with, because once they start stacking, they will go against overdraw and they can become really expensive. Another also important thing to note is in this case, for example, this particle effect has a light attached to the emitter itself. In some cases that's fine, but it's not something you always want to do. In most cases, like on a jump pad or a teleporter, you actually want to remove the light from the particle and control it within the map itself. That way you can do a lot of things like set min spec and stuff like that. But more importantly, you can make it a shadow casting light. You can't have that option from a particle based light. And lastly, the most important thing about light performance is the debug mode used to see light complexity. So if I bring up my console and I can double click the field to search for possible variables, let me move this window out of the way. You want to look for one that's called deferred shading debug, and you want to set that value to 3. And what you're seeing here is the level painted on light complexity. By default, all you see is no light, or it's being affected by some light. By default, you see there's one light already on everything, and that's the sunlight and the skylight. They're both combined into their own. Now, whenever you add another light onto the scene, you'll see it change. This shows you how the light's actually being hit on the surfaces. Omnidirectional lights can be a little confusing to see sometimes because they're not exactly accurate to what's going on, but it gives you good enough understanding that you have a light here and it's affecting all that space. Now if I copy this over, you'll see that I just now all of a sudden got another stack. And if I copy another one, I got another stack, and more and more and more. The more you go, you're going to see that light change and get brighter and brighter and brighter. As soon as you're hitting that white, that means that's bad. That's really expensive. The lights over the stacking, that's light complexity, and that gets, really hurtful on performance. You want to make sure you're not doing that. Whenever we're placing lights around, we always reserve, we try to at least be like, hey, here's the sunlight, skylight, the environment probe, and here's maybe one placed light with the possibility of it overlapping another one, maybe. One really cool thing also is whenever you're using a projected texture, let's go ahead and hook up one real quick, you will see that it's not using as much space. It's containing the frustum. If you're not projecting in all directions, it's containing the frustum just to one view. So this actually makes things a lot easier, and again, that's why I say try to stay away from Omni lights if you can, because when it comes to our deferred shading debug, you're able to control and adjust how expensive, and the overlaps a lot more. And this even goes into effect where if you go into this mode, once you're done placing your lights and you see these placed lights still overlapping each other, adjusting its FOV lower will also adjust that. So it's something to keep in mind whenever you're trying to overlap these things. So if I'm going in here where there's an environment probe placed already, and I place a light, this is generally as complex as you would want to see a scene. Maybe every now and then you'll have an overlap like that. Try to keep it as simple as that. If you're going more complex, you're going to start hitting performance problems. I understand sometimes you might want to have those lights that are really fancy, and that's cool. Just make sure you're setting the min spec to very high at that point. And once you're setting it to very high, then you'll be nice enough to know, hey, if you're a player and you're going into very high, you better expect there's going to be a lot of things that yourself as an artist, you're trying to give to the player to show off really good graphics. And to turn off deferred shading, you simply just go into, change that back to 0, and that's about it. Just make sure you kind of focus on that deferred shading debug. It's really important, and it's really the primary way to detect and observe lighting performance and its cost in your map.